Today's guest, Daniel Kraus, is a New York Times best-selling author of such books as Rotter's Scowler, The Death and Life of Zebulon Finch, and he's also known for his collaborations with Guillermo del Toro on Troll Hunters and The Shape of Water. We discuss how those led to his collaboration with George Romero on the book The Living Dead. And I can tell you, that is a real work of art. 694 pages of zombies, gore, and more. And it's been hailed around the world as a masterpiece. We discuss that, the difficulties of writing comic books, and much more right after this. Daniel, thank you very much indeed for joining us today. So obviously we're here to talk about, amongst other things, this wonderful book. I'm going to make sure that I've actually got this on. Yeah, we are. The Living Dead. But I'd like to kind of come to that in a little while. And you'll notice that I've bookmarked something because I'd just like to share a little bit of it later on with everybody. There's no spoilers, it's halfway through. So what I wondered was when did you first start writing?
Well, for me, it really started incredibly young, maybe first grade. So, we're talking 6, 7 years old.
Right.
I had a friend. It really started with a friend of mine. I lived in a small town in the middle of the country. And a friend who lived in my neighborhood started drawing pictures of monsters, just, made up monsters, sort of Godzilla type creatures. And so I started doing it too. And so we both had our flavors of monsters. And I think what happened was eventually we wanted something to do with them. And so we started writing stories where the monsters would attack each other. And so, I just kept going with that. Eventually he kind of lost interest and stopped writing in that kind of way. But I kept going, and I continued to just write stories, and eventually I introduced some human characters. And, by the time I was in middle school, I was writing what would be considered novella type length stuff. And then certainly by high school, I was writing novel length things. And these weren't projects that I was showing anyone. They were just, for me. And so it wasn't, and this has served me well in my career. I was never writing for praise or anything like that. I was writing just because it was something that I found really enjoyable. And when I finished a book or a novella or a project, I would just kind of feel happy about it. And then I would put it in a drawer, and that'd be it.
So do you have any, or have you gone back to those pieces of work and redone them, brought them out?
Well, recently, the University of Pittsburgh acquired all my archives. So I did have a chance just in the past year to unpack some boxes and look at some of this stuff. Now, my books today often gestate for a really long time. So I have story ideas that began when I was a kid that have become novels when I was an adult. So among the material that I sent to Pittsburgh was a short story that I wrote when I was probably 12 or something. And that became the sort of genesis of a novel that I wrote many years later. So a lot of those, not a lot, but a few of those nuggets that I came up with back then really have stayed with me. And I have turned them into real projects. Generally when I went through and kind of scanned the work, it's certainly, I was a kid, it's rough stuff. But it was impressive in some ways, mostly in the amount of material that I created. I was I'm a prolific author now, and I was then too. It's just the volume of material is kind of impressive.
It certainly sounds like very. I think I kind of remember starting to write page. You know, I definitely completed one short story as a teenager.
Hmm.
That's it. Yeah, and I
Uh-huh.
wrote those teenage poems that no one is ever going to see because they're terrible.
Yeah, I was lucky enough to not ever write any teenage poetry. I don't know how I dodged that bullet, but I did.
Who did anyone encourage you to write particularly?
Well, yeah, I mean, my mom was, she used to credit for a lot of my career. Um, she was someone who encouraged it. Again, I wasn't really showing these stories to anyone, including her, but she, of course, knew that I was writing them, and um, was very supportive. And I had a teacher in middle school who was supportive, and it was, she had the first class that I'd ever encountered um, that was really centered around creative writing, which, you know, and at that time in this state was pretty experimental.
Hmm.
It, but so that was exciting to actually be in a class where I could actually do some writing, and that, which I was doing anyway, and actually get grades for it. But I used it more of as a workshop. Like I still did my, what I considered my serious writing at home,
Right.
and then use this class to experiment with different forms and voices and stuff. But again, although I had some encouragement, um, there there wasn't a ton of it. Partly because I wasn't looking for it, and partly because I don't think it was considered a viable career path at all. And I certainly didn't consider it one either. It was, I didn't know any working artists. I didn't know anyone who knew any working artists. I mean, it was just, it, in that small town. It wasn't a really a possibility. So it was really just kind of something I was passionate about as a hobby. I never really thought it could be a career.
Right. Right. And so you were kind of also writing monsters from a very early age,
Hmm.
which kind of which is a theme throughout your work. I think having looked at some of your other work, um, and being absolutely fascinated by the stuff that you're dealing with, but which seems to be a lot about coming of age.
Hmm.
Looking at is that a very deliberate choice, or is that just the way it happens that
I
this
think
sounds like a
it's,
really cool idea?
yeah, I think it's not really a deliberate choice. I have tended to write a lot about teenagers, or people who are at least younger.
Mm,
And that again is not something that I'm setting out to do, but there's something about the stories that I write that I tend to gravitate towards those characters. Um, and I can't say why. And it doesn't. That's not the case for all my books, but
no,
um, there, it's one of those kind of ineffable things where I don't really know why. But I just keep returning, in such a way that even I've started books writing in the characters 35 or something, and by the time I get done with it, they're 18. You know, for some reason I find myself coming back to that age range quite a bit.
that yes, that's really interesting. I think I've heard of writers writing, for example, writing all their characters as men and then
Hmm.
just changing some of the names to women.
Hmm.
Um, but yeah, they're fairly instinctual things when we create stuff. So a lot of the stuff you write is scary, and certainly there are some very scary moments in this book. What scares you?
Well, in art, very little scares me. I think as growing up as a kid, I certainly got scared by movies and books, just like any kid does.
Mhm.
And even had periods where I really couldn't watch, or I just couldn't stomach it when I was, an adolescent maybe. Today, in art, I'm almost never ever scared. It's extremely rare for me to to read something and be scared by it. Extremely rare to watch a movie and be scared by it. That doesn't mean I really enjoy them. I really do. I still, horror is still probably my favorite genre of all. But things in real life scare me a lot. Like it's one of those kind of classic situations where, yeah, I mean, I'm a human being, so I see things all the time that scare me. The news is terrifying on a daily basis.
Mm.
And so you have to try to control that. You'll just be a mess 24/7. So there's to persist in life today, you need to be able to constantly be able to control your fear and your panic. And I think one way to maybe, and this is just a theory, to exercise those muscles of control is to partake in art that challenges you, right? Um, as a young kid, I would see something really scary, a TV show or a movie, and I'd run away and feel ill or whatever. But I'd always come back to it. Like I'd always challenge myself again and say, I'm going to watch that movie again and see if I can take it. And I think there's probably something to that. The kind of person who would just never look at it again. And then there's me who would constantly test my limits. And I think that's maybe helps with staying calm when things really do go wrong in life.
It's interesting. I remember probably about 2 months into lockdown over here. So we're talking probably around about the beginning of June. They published an article. There was an article in The Guardian over here saying, yeah, people who like horror movies and are preppers, etc., are doing much better in the current situation than people who don't, because they've exercised those muscles, basically. They know how to deal with it. I remember, the times when I think, oh, you can't show the horror, scary movies to kids or anything like that. And I think they love it. They really enjoy it, because how do you learn? How do you learn to deal with emotions otherwise?
Yeah, you need a safe way to test your limits, and there's really not much safer than a movie or a book. You can turn away from those, you can close the book. It's a perfectly safe way to test your limits. I am fully in favor of kids watching and reading horror. I did it from a very young age, 5 or 6 years old. My mom was having me watch horror stuff with her, and but she wasn't like strapping me down. I could leave if I wanted to, and I'm sure that I did. But being able to, from a young age, being able to test my limits like that was extremely self-educating and informative about what I was and what I wasn't, and things and ideas that I could engage with that were outside the everyday norm. And I actually think that partaking in horror actually really can stir the creativity. It doesn't mean you need to go on to become a horror author or a horror filmmaker. You could write romance, but I think something about testing your limits early, which horror is good at, can really lead to creativity as an adult, just because you've tested your limits.
Yes. Yeah. I always remember the moment that I discovered that and this is probably in my late 30s, early 40s, I discovered I developed a fear of heights again. It was when I walked up to, looking down on a courtyard from the first gallery, what I think of as first floor, Americans think of as second floor. And just looking down and just thinking, I've got this fear back again. What can, and I thought I'd overcome this. I remember basically going up the Eiffel Tower, and actually having to visit it twice because they closed off the top section the first time I visited, and it was absolutely terrifying.
Yeah.
But after an hour or so at the very, very top of the Eiffel Tower looking down, it's like, okay, I've got this now. I can deal with this. And it does help you deal with other stuff. You think, okay, if I can overcome this, I can overcome that. That's good.
Yeah, I mean that's impressive because I do think it's harder to do as an adult. I think when you're a kid, it kind of comes naturally, and your brain is just in sort of absorption mode, and you're constantly in everything you do, sort
Mm.
of figuring out what you're afraid of, what you're not, what you can overcome. I think it's harder as an adult. I think it's if you're scared of heights and you're in your 30s or something. I think it's tough. It's like
Yeah.
too much. You know too
Yeah.
much about yourself. It's harder to trick yourself as an adult. So that's impressive.
Well, thank you. I mean, I also was very interested to read online that London Zoo allows people who are arachnophobes to
Hmm.
come in and meet tarantulas.
Wow.
And they reckon they can do it within about a week. They can cure people of arachnophobia within
Wow.
just by introducing them. I think a lot of it, when you're thinking about something the size of a tarantula, you're probably thinking scare of the unknown. This is a thing you don't normally encounter.
Hmm.
But also, if you can actually deal with that big thing, then you can deal with the little house spider running across
Right.
the
Right.
across the thing. Okay, cool. Well, thank you very much for sharing that with us. So you're writing Scowlers, Rotters, the Monsters variations, and then you did the Troll Hunters with Guillermo del Toro. How did that? When did you meet Guillermo del Toro?
Well, I met him on that project. He had read Rotters, my two books previous to that,
Right.
and really liked it. And he had a publishing deal in place for Troll Hunters as a novel, um, and was kind of casting around for a co-author for it. And it was about kids, and I had written I'd written at that point 3 books about not not kids really, but teenagers. The
Mm-hmm.
characters in Troll Hunters were a little younger. So I think I was kind of in the right place at the right time. He had read Rotters recently and thought that I might be the right person to pair with for that. So it was pretty simple. I think we we sent him and his manager my other work, and he liked it. And then we talked on the phone maybe a bit, and I flew to Toronto, and we met there, and we kind of hashed out the plot of the book. A lot of it he already had, but um, had a bunch of questions. We figured it out, and that was it. And that's how we got into business together.
Wow. And obviously really enjoyed it because you then went on to do The Shape of Water.
Hmm. Yeah. So that came about because of Troll Hunters, because we were working on Troll Hunters, and I'd mentioned to him this idea I had for what I thought at that point would be a book, The Shape of Water, which did ultimately become a book and movie. Um, and he loved it, and he optioned the idea. And then a few years later, actually made the movie, and we wrote the book. And so, yeah, a lot happened in the first day we met. We accomplished a lot.
Which, how do you find collaborating with people? Obviously, with Georgia, it's a slightly different story, but and I think really Guillermo is the only person you really collaborated with.
Mm-hmm.
How do you find that how is that different apart from the obvious things to
It's
writing just for yourself?
Yeah, it's definitely different. When I write alone, and I always try to set up certain challenges for myself, and that's a way of making sure I don't write the same thing over and over again. I think when you're starting out, you don't worry about that as much because you're really just sort of figuring out how to write a novel, what that feels like.
Mm.
But as you get into book 7 or 8, you run the danger of repeating yourself, or just it feels just like a Daniel Kraus book. You want to shake yourself up, so I tend to create problems for myself. Like, this book is going to be written in this particular voice, or this book's going to be written in this format that's somehow restraining, and it kind of forces me to change up how I write, and not get into any kind of comfortable space. With collaboration, that's kind of baked into the model, because you're going to have somebody else who's offering ideas, and they're not always going to jive with yours, or they're going to come at things from a different angle. Um, and that's going to force you to think creatively and find different ways to solve problems and find ways to feel passionate about someone else's idea that they came up with instead of you, and vice versa. So it's, and even though the Romero project was different because George wasn't with us, still there were ways that I found to create that kind of
Mm,
push and pull, which is really what you want. Otherwise, I don't know why you're collaborating. Like you want that sense of two or at least two voices trying to come up with something that's a third voice.
right, right. Uh, and actually, something I possibly should have asked earlier on, but what I find interesting, how do you structure your books? Do you thinking in how you're
Mm-hmm.
writing yourself? Do you just think, okay, this is a really cool idea, these are really cool characters, go? Or do
Mm-hmm.
you spend some time, this is my story arc, I'm going
Mm-hmm.
to now hang this scene, oh, that's a cool scene.
Right.
What's your kind of process?
Generally, I do lots of planning. Uh, often, often the sort of spark of an idea, and you just start writing. That does happen, um, and usually that's uh, just to see if this idea feels good once you got it on the page. But that I usually don't go very far with that. You know, I might write kind of off the top of my head for a little bit, but then once I'm like, okay, I've got something here, then I usually stop and do a lot of planning. And again, you know, I have ideas. Most of my novels are ideas that I've thought about for a really long time, some of them decades, always at least years. So um, I spent a lot of time thinking about them, um, and then do usually quite extensive outlines. You know, if it's a large book like Living Dead, definitely do
Mm,
a lot of structural outlines. There's a lot of intricate timeline things going on. If it's a historical novel, you'll get into a big mess if you don't take note of um, just sort of global events and that kind of thing. So I do quite a bit of planning, and my outlines alone can be 50, 75, 100 pages. So, if they're complicated, I also have very complicated timelines to go with that. And I don't feel that's constraining at all. I think some people, when they hear that, they think, oh, that doesn't sound much fun. But it actually, you know, I spend months and years doing that work so that when I actually set to writing, I can feel completely free and not have to worry about, um, am I going down a wrong path that I'm going to spend 300 pages that I'm going to have to throw away. Instead, I can just really focus on the language and how the sentences work, and you never really stick to the outline anyway. You always end up going a little afield. Uh, so I found that it's actually quite liberating and leads to better writing for me.
and now I know a few writers, funnily enough, different generation to you, probably started writing in the 70s, the ones I'm thinking of, my mates basically. And back then we had manual typewriters, we had
Mm-hmm.
pen and paper. And one of them I know is very, even today, when he writes pen and paper. He's
Mm-hmm.
never really adopted. What about yourself? Are you a millennial child?
No, I'm not. I'm not that young, but yeah, I type. It is interesting. Like most writers I know who don't write longhand, you know, our writing muscles are just weak. Like, and I can't write longhand very long before my hand just aches. Like we don't have that muscle anymore.
Mm,
It's like a physical thing. Um, I take a lot of notes longhand. Like I have, well, if they're over there, but I just take copious notes constantly on these little notebooks. So I do have some moderate exercise I'm doing there. But I know authors who are my age who do write longhand, and their reasons for doing so are compelling. It does certainly slow you down,
mm,
so you're putting probably more thought into each word because it takes a few seconds to write a long word. And so, I think there is something to it, and I've always been tempted to try it, particularly my ideas that are historical. So if I'm writing a book that takes place in the 1800s or something, I'm intrigued by the idea of writing it longhand just to see if there's, this would be, as I was saying before, where I give
Mm.
myself certain sort of problems and challenges. I think it'd be interesting to see if that led to a certain different kind of writing style.
Interesting. Very interesting. Thank you. Okay, cool. So let's move on to this wonderful book, which I so enjoyed. As I was saying to you earlier on, I only finished it this afternoon, because it was, and thank you very much indeed, Audible, because that helped a lot, being able just to listen to stuff while I was out on the road. And I have to say, the fact that Audible will allow you to speed things up,
Mm-hmm.
and you can actually listen to it even faster, that I found very useful as well. What's the story? I mean, I know the backstory of this, but for those of you people who don't, how did you get involved?
Well, it's a both a short story and kind of a long story. Long in the sort of time span. Uh, I knew Chris Rowe, a manager, who you know very well,
Yeah,
um, from way back, way back. We're talking. We went to the same high school in the same small town in Iowa. So um, the fact that we both grew up to work in the arts is pretty incredible. And we weren't best friends or anything, but we were certainly friendly. Um, and then we graduated, went off our separate ways, and then many years later, I don't know, 20 years, I don't know, I was reading an article about George Romero, who was my absolute hero, my favorite artist in any art form. And I noticed that in the article they thank his manager, Chris Rowe, and I thought, is there any chance this could be the same guy? um, so I sort of sought him out, and it turns out it was, and we reconnected um, briefly. And he was like, "Look, next time I'm in town with George, I'll let you know. We can get together." And a few months later, he was, and so I came down to the convention center where they were, and I, it was great to see Chris again, and uh, met George, which was the only time I ever met him in person. And we certainly weren't talking business. It was just a social visit, just chit chatting in the hotel room. Um, and then that was kind of it. And then again, we all went our separate ways. And then about 10 years later, 10 or 12 years later, George died in 2017. And maybe a month after that, I got a call from Chris. And again, it'd been another decade has passed since I've heard from him. And it was he and Suze, George's wife, were going through some of his projects that were left unfinished. And he sort of first and foremost among them was this big zombie epic novel that he had been working on for about 10 years on and off. Um, and it was, important to him and seemed to be an integral piece of this zombie story that he invented in 1968 and been working on for 50 years. And this was an important part of that story. And they were wondering if I would be interested in taking a whack at finishing it. I think, he wasn't just saying that because I knew him when we were kids. At that point I had become, somewhat successful as an author, and I think had done a couple successful collaborations with Guillermo del Toro. But one thing Chris knew about me, in addition to all that stuff, which was public knowledge, is that I was more than a fan of George. I was a real student of his, and this became important to him and his wife, George's wife. Um, I wasn't obsessed with his zombie movies. I was deeply interested in all of his work. And again, I was a real student of it. I really studied the films. I read all the scholarly analyses of them. And George really changed how I grew up as a kid. Night of the Living Dead was the first film I remember seeing. I'm sure I saw things before that, but it's the first movie that I remember having an impact on me at age like 6 or something. Um, and his movies really affected me as a person growing up, and then certainly as an artist later. Um, they meant everything to me. He was a real father figure to me. So I had a deep understanding and love for his work. So all those things put together, they decided I would be a good candidate to do this. Um, I was, of course, stunned uh, at the opportunity, um, uh, and I said yes, absolutely. Although there was, certain trepidation to getting involved with somebody who was my hero and who was so important to me. And considering this was one of his final works, there was a lot of responsibility involved with that. But I don't think you can't say no to something like that. It felt like the completing of a giant circle that began when I was 5 or 6 years old with Night of the Living Dead, and now here was this sort of other bookend to his zombie tale, and I was going to get to become a part of it. So that's sort of the backstory of how it happened.
And I happen to know that you were the first person that Chris thought of when when he was thinking about this, and I know they reached out really quite. It was within a month or so.
Yeah, it was
George's passing.
It was pretty quick, and it really came out of the blue because we weren't we weren't really hadn't been in touch in a long time. But I was slightly aware he had been working on it. Like every once in a while in an interview, George would mention that he was working on a book, but there was never a lot of information about it, and people didn't pick up on it that much. But so when he said there was this zombie novel that George had been writing, it did trigger something in my head. I was like, yeah, that's right. I did read about him working on this giant novel, just because I was a fanatic for anything that reported on what George was working on. So yeah, I mean, it means a lot to me that they thought of me for this. And my goal throughout was to not screw it up and to treat it as seriously as you might treat an unfinished Rembrandt or something, like to treat it like a extremely important work of art. And my plan was to bring everything I could to the table, and reach as deep into his work and his life as possible to inform writing the parts that weren't there.
Right. So it's interesting. You mentioned earlier on, you touched on earlier on, that he'd had obviously you'd seen Night of the Living Dead when you were very young, but this effect became an interest which you pursued kind of through the rest of your life. So by scholarly articles, was it just the films? I guess it was just the films, because that's mostly what George was known for.
Yeah.
What was it that most inspired you about George's work?
Well, I mean, it's hard to say. As I think it was when I was really young and really, for the first however many years of my life, it was really just Night of the Living Dead. So this was pre-VHS, really. So it'd be a while till I saw anything else. I think it was kind of like we were speaking about earlier. It was shocking. I think it's a story that's simple enough for a kid to understand. Like, I think a kid understands that the home is supposed to be a safe space, and there are things outside the home that are scary. And that's essentially the plot of Night of the Living Dead. But then, of course, there was that the moment at the end where Ben gets shot. That was like, I don't think as a kid I understood that you could do that in a movie. That you could. I'd probably seen Disney movies and stuff before then. Like, I didn't understand that you could have this heroic character, and I was probably surrounded by cartoons and movies, superheroes and He-Man and whatever, Star Wars, and you just didn't do that. You just didn't senselessly, cruelly kill your protagonist, your hero. I think that really opened my mind to the potential power of art. Um, uh, if you could do that, man, you could. I mean, all bets are off. You can do anything. I think I was, even from a young age, I was tantalized or fascinated by um, dark endings. I was fascinated by a certain element of bleakness. Um, I liked and I responded to also in various Twilight Zone episodes, which were the other thing that I consumed a lot of as a kid. It was basically Night of the Living Dead and Twilight Zone. Like certain Twilight Zone episodes, Romero's films, especially his zombie films, were about groups of people in sort of trapped in single locations, and they sort of end up squabbling and end up destroying themselves, sort of irrespective to what else is happening. Whatever the threat was supposed to be, the threat was actually inside, not outside. So I think all that stuff fascinated me, and the fact that I had George Romero and Rod Serling as my artistic beacons was fortunate, because they were progressive people. They were interested in social justice. They were interested in ideas of class and race and all these things that I think immediately began to work on me subconsciously. I grew up in small town Midwestern, the state of Iowa in America. So we're talking a small town, almost everyone's white, probably pretty conservative. So having these more progressive artists sort of guiding my way, I think really changed who I was as a person. So I'm really thankful for that, grateful that and feel lucky.
Right, right. It's it is fascinating, and I think it's something that comes across in the novel. And there's just I loved it. I was reading it this afternoon, not trying to get to the end, not just because I had a deadline I needed to meet, but just because it's a page turner. It's like, oh, please, please, no, I want them. It's there is a lot going on. I think what I really liked about and appreciated it, you have captured George's interest in society and the way society behaves. And what I find fascinating reading it today, and you could not have foreseen this in the slightest, was how it relates to our current situation in terms of the pandemic, in terms of politics, in terms of the way people are behaving. I was reading this, and I was also reading about the wildfires that are going on in the west of your country. And the fact that one reporter was saying that, he was out, he was trying to do coverage, and he happened to be with a reporter of color, and they came across men with guns, not wearing badges, but very obviously blocking the road, supposedly protecting the township that was being threatened by the fire. And I think it's that kind of thing that is reflected so well in this book. And I want to share with you, if I may, just something, because it just completely made me physically laugh out loud whilst I was listening to this. And this is about a character called Etta Hoffman. I got that reference immediately to the Tales of Hoffman. I thought, nice naming of that. But there was this bit, because basically this lady is recording stories of the people and how they're experiencing the zombie apocalypse. And the ones that she's talking about here were housewives forming covens as a means of survival, stopgap police forces burning citizens to contain what they stubbornly believed was a biological agent, a young man encouraged by the chaos to play out delusions of vampirism, a troop of Ren Fair motorcyclists who believe their Arthurian code Their Arthurian code could withstand any strain. A paraplegic man trapped indoors, tortured by his helper monkey, begging her to send help. Such strange tales, and Hoffman read them over and over. One day they might remind us who we used to be and who we tried to be, and that recollection could save the world. I just
Yeah.
It's something I think, but I thought what I found interesting, particularly in that, is the power of story,
Yeah.
because this character plays such a vital role. Was this something that George had put in originally?
No, that bit was definitely me. There's little bits of the book here and there that reflect, that are my homage to George, that
Mm.
reflect George as a person, um, uh, and relationships that he had and some of the life he lived. That's all sort of woven into the plot as well. And his stories, as I said, dramatically affected who I am, and now I'm in a position where my stories can dramatically affect other people. So the power of stories is something that, and George would have been far too humble to put this in the book, but they can change. One person, I can talk to someone today and maybe change, the way their life is going. It'd be amazing if that happened. But when you create a work of art, it has the power to change a lot of people's minds. So that section, which is of course referencing a bunch of other George Romero films, is my way of kind of acknowledging that these things are important. And these stories, even when times are dark, as they are in this book, or as they kind of are right now in real life, these things can guide us, and these things can inspire us and point us in the right directions. If we have the right leaders, and I think George was one, if we keep our eyes on them, we can get out of this darkness. We can have hope for a brighter day. Yeah, I got little kind of goosebumps when you read that. And it's not often that I would get goosebumps of something that I wrote myself, but yeah, it kind of makes me think again about how important his work is, and not just his work, people's work is to other people. And the stories are going to be what sustain us.
I think you're absolutely right. Totally. And I think the only way we are going to get through, because stories, the stories that we are told by politicians, the stories we're told by, the whole thing about fake news. We live in such challenging times, and being able to actually understand how that whole process works, I think, is really important for people now, and what the risks are in not understanding those lessons. So, as I say, I really love this book. I only finished it this afternoon. I kind of I want to go back and reread it again more slowly now, just because apart from anything else, I really enjoyed the characters.
Yeah.
And apart from anything else, I've actually already just purchased Troll Hunters as well, because I want to read that. And that's really I want to read your other books, but the only reason was that I had to have stumbled across Troll Hunters on Netflix a few months back, and I've been watching that very avidly and really enjoying that.
Well, it'll be interesting to you because the book is very different. The show was adapted from the book, but the book is tonally a lot different. The characters are a little older. It's much darker. It's far less funny. It's still a little funny, but so it's an interesting comparison.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things that I always find very interesting when one learns about these things and think, oh, okay, oh, it's based on a book. I wonder what that's like. And I love the fact that they're very different, because I think they're very different pieces of art aimed at different audiences primarily. But yes, so that's the first one. But having read all the blurbs on your other books, I was like, oh yeah, really like the Gravedigger idea and the and the other ones.
Well, my interest in George Romero is proven by a book I wrote called Empire Decayed, which is the second. I wrote a 2-book series called The Death and Life of Zebulon Finch, which takes place over 100 years. And there's a section in the 60s where the main character begins thinking that Night of the Living Dead, which is a new movie at that point in time, is sending secret messages to him in the same way that Charles Manson thought the White Album was sending messages to him.
Yeah.
This person feels the same thing about Night of the Living Dead, and it becomes sort of an important piece of the plot. So even before this book that I worked on, I was already working Romero stuff into my novels.
Wow. Yes, that's the other one I really want to look at as well, because it does sound absolutely fascinating. Moving on, what else have you got coming up? I noticed, well, you put up on Instagram a little sketch for a graphic novel.
Oh, yeah.
I assume, is this autumnal?
No.
Another one.
So the things I have coming out is I have this book coming out. As of this recording, it comes out in a few days, but by the time this goes live, this will be out. And this is the first book of a trilogy. And this is for kids. This is for maybe grades 4 to 6.
Right.
Called the trilogy is called the Teddy's Saga, and the first one is They Threw Us Away. And it is indeed about teddy bears, but it's a fairly dark story that follows the journey of these teddy bears who wake up in a trash dump, a landfill, and they don't know why they were thrown away because they're brand new. And so they kind of embark on this long 3-book journey of trying to figure out why this happened. And then I have the autumnal, as you mentioned, it's a comic book, 8-issue comic that starts at the end of September. And then everything beyond that, there are several other projects going, but none of them are announced yet. But one of them, one of them is a graphic novel. And then there's some other books and some other stuff too, so other media. But those haven't been announced yet, so you'll just have to wait.
Right. What I found fascinating was the way that you did this, because I wrote comics back in the 90s, and I remember having to, in those days, it was like having to plan out all the different pages and working out if I got, how do the pages physically turn?
Yeah, that's before we started this call, I was literally working on it, and there's so much. It's such a different kind of thinking that you don't get in novels, you don't get in screenplays, even where you're thinking about just chunks of content and how do they break on a page, and how do they break on a panel, and how do they break on a page turn. The rhythm is so much more intricate.
It's fun. I found it challenging. I also found it terribly good exercise, because it's like, okay, this is the story I want to tell. How can I get it? How can I make it as concise, but also use the power of image, courtesy of the artist?
It's all about being concise, and it's and then you have to free yourself up to take advantage of the form, and something I learned in the autumnal, that I don't think any other format, movies, whatever, can jump sort of can make temporal jumps or geographic jumps. Someone can be talking, and suddenly while they're talking, you can show something from their past or something that's happening in some other part of the world, and it just magically works. Whereas in a movie, you'd have to sort of establish that in a different way. In books, it's much more difficult. You'd have to explain what the heck you're doing. So there's a lot of it that's unique and inspiring, definitely.
Yeah, it's fun. Well, we're nearly at the end of our hour, but I did want to wrap up by just asking you a few questions.
Sure.
Section titled "The Luggage in the Crypt." So you're about to take your last journey, and you've been told you have to bring along your own entertainment. What film would you take?
This one is tough because I mean, I'm tempted to be really pragmatic about these answers, and I'm like, all right, I want to take a really long, complicated film because I'm going to be stuck with this. So I want something that's like 5 hours long. Those are kind of answers that are less fun. I mean, really, the movie that I've seen more than any, and that is truly my favorite movie of all time, is Night of the Living Dead. I never stop watching that, and never stop being inspired and comforted by it. Strangely, if I had to pick another movie besides that that just feels like home to me, it's probably The Wicker Man, which is just a film that I really love and find. I feel very affectionate towards it. An odd kind of warmness to it that I've always responded to, even though it's got this kind of chilling element to it.
this is this is not a description, and this is a great choice. I
Uh,
thoroughly applaud the choice. I've never heard the word warm associated with the Wicker Man before.
well, I kind of always feel like I kind of want to live on Summer Isle. They're so happy. They're these like totally satisfied pagans. I mean, just it seems like they got a good life going there in the island.
That's very true, actually. Yeah, and yeah, living away on an island. I think particularly at the moment, the idea
Yeah,
of living away on the
yeah,
island
right.
where everyone gets on terribly well, everyone knows how everything works.
Yeah,
They've got the harvest coming in, and yeah, that sounds pretty good at the
yeah,
moment.
not
Yeah,
bad.
yeah, yeah. Okay, what book would you take with you?
I think I would take, They Threw Us Away, which I just referenced, is my homage to one of my favorite books, Watership Down. And when I was maybe in middle school, so that was probably around 12 years old or so. And I was really into Stephen King, and I read something that he wrote where he talked about how much he loved Watership Down. At that point, this is pre-internet. I didn't know what it was. But he referenced that it was about rabbits, and it made no sense to me. Why would Stephen King be interested in this book about rabbits? So I went to the library, and of course a very small library, but famous book, so they had it. And I read it and just loved it. And I understood what King loved about it. It was this kind of Lord of the Rings style epic, but done with these vulnerable little characters. And so my Teddy saga is similar. They're on this big dark journey, but they're extremely vulnerable. Teddy bears are even more vulnerable than rabbits. That book is one that is it, again, is a very comforting book to me, and I've read it many times, and we'll read it again. And I love, and it's very deep. It's got its own wonderful mythology, and it's just a brilliant, brilliant book that I think I I could spend most of eternity enjoying.
It's. I'm trying to remember. I've certainly seen the film, and I think I read the book, but of course, it's that image from the
Mm-hmm.
film that I immediately, the animated film,
Yeah,
and I think they've done a number of different versions of it. Um, I think there's a more recent version of it that came out.
yeah, but that original animated film is pretty great. Yeah.
It, yeah, again, I think it traumatized.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean my book will do the same. I mean, there are gonna be kids who it's a little too intense for, and but they'll stop reading it if it's too intense for them,
Yeah,
and other
absolutely.
people will be totally inspired by it, and it'll stick with them because it was kind of intense, and they'll someday write their own books.
Which is a great outcome. It's a great outcome as far as I'm concerned. What musical album would you take with you?
There's a couple ways I could go with this. I think I'm going to go with a sort of, for lack of a better term, this kind of indie rock album called Alien Lanes by Guided by Voices, who were my favorite band for most of my life. Uh, Not that they are anymore, but my taste diversified. But they were probably if I had to say what was in my life here on my last journey, what was my favorite band? It was Guided by Voices, and they were in that era anyway. They were kings of extreme lo-fi, so they would just record their albums on boom boxes or whatever. Like it was extremely low resolution, and that was inspiring at that time. This idea that you could make this great art just on your own, you could just do it yourself, and I think that inspired a lot of my attitude towards art. Because that's how I wrote my books as a kid. I just did it entirely myself and didn't show it to anyone. Didn't feel the need to. So I like the idea of just being able to create, and the creation itself being rewarding, not the reception. You could tell this band was having just the greatest time of their life recording this in their basement, and they weren't caring too much about what the reception was. And I've always hoped to have that sort of model in my own creative life.
Right. I shall look forward to checking that out. I've heard of Guided by Voices. I swear I've heard at least one of their tracks. I can't name it off the top, but I know I've heard of that band, so I shall go and check that out. What about a favorite food?
Favorite food? This one's really hard because I'm not a real food person. There's not something I would immediately come to mind here. I always think back to when I was a kid and how I'd always, and I still kind of do this. I'd have a bowl of cereal before I went to bed. So again, a lot of my answers to you for this final journey have been ones of comfort. Like what's something that I wouldn't mind kind of snuggling down with for eternity. And I think a good old fashioned bowl of cereal might be it.
That sounds great. I do the same every so often. There's, it feels slightly wrong, but that's part of the enjoyment as far as I'm concerned. Yeah. It's like, I can do this. I'm an adult. If I want to eat muesli at 9 o'clock at night, I am allowed to do this now.
Absolutely.
What a piece of visual art you take with you?
This one I also find difficult to, I'm looking around at the various pieces of art in my office here, and it's right there is a photograph that the aforementioned Chris Rowe took of George and I the one time we met.
Right.
And that, I might say that like it's I'm not a big fan type of person. I'm not somebody who gets people's autographs and takes pictures. I think that stuff is awesome, but for whatever reason I don't have a collector gene in me.
No.
So I don't tend to collect things. I tend to get rid of, I'm the opposite. I tend to get rid of everything constantly. I have to stop myself from getting rid of stuff. But this was a special kind of memory to me, especially now that George and I ended up kind of collaborating in a way. And it is sort of a visual memory of that. As cheesy as it sounds, like your kind of weirdest, wildest dreams can come true.
Yes, absolutely. That's a great choice, a very good choice. And what about one luxury?
Luxury, I could have said this for food, is I'm going to just go with coffee, good coffee. I have become a coffee person over the years, and I just want some good Guatemalan, Ethiopian, some nice honey washed, whatever process you want. I'd like some good coffee in my eternal crypt.
Right.
It's got to be fresh though, so I don't know how they're going to get it in, but you worry
they'll
about
leave
that.
a little chute.
Okay. Oh, okay. The crypt has a chute.
Yeah, it'll just drop.
Sorry, I didn't get the schemata of how this crypt is arranged.
Yeah,
so.
Yeah. I think we can do that, and there'll be a supply of water, and
that's great.
There'll be whatever it is we need. If there's a pyramid, then we'll have solar panels on the top just to make sure you can heat water. Is this going to be filtered? Do you put it in a cafetiere? Do you put it through an espresso machine? Or
might as well just hand grind it. We'll just go old fashioned with it. I have all the time in the world, after all, to make this coffee.
Right. Right, that sounds like a great way of seeing through eternity. I like that idea. And it'll keep the brain cells going for
Yes.
more stories. I can see the inside of the crypt being scraped with
Yeah,
stories
I
that
mean, you know,
short
like I
novels.
said, when I was a kid, I wrote and didn't show it to anyone. There's no reason to think that in my eternal crypt I won't keep writing.
Brilliant. I think that's a great point at which to end it. Okay, Daniel, thank you so much. This has been so much fun.
Oh, thank you. This is great. Anytime.
Well, that was fun. I really did enjoy The Living Dead, which completes George Romero's zombie films. Next week, it's Halloween, and when the clock ticks down to the chattering hour to celebrate, I'm joined by two special guests. First up is John Carpenter alumni Nancy Loomis from Halloween 1, 2, and 3, Assault on Precinct 13, and The Fog. Then I'm joined by Courtney Gaines from the classic Stephen King Children of the Corn. Plus, we also discuss many other films from his over 40-year career in Hollywood. See you then, and in the meantime, stay safe and well.